April 10th, 1944, London, England. The rain came in slow grey sheets, tapping against the rusted roof of an old factory on the east side of London. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Windows boarded, smokestacks cold, doors chained shut. But behind those walls, hidden beneath the steady hum of the war-torn city, something extraordinary was being built. Not weapons, not ammunition, but illusions. Inside, under the flickering light of hanging lamps, dozens of men and women worked in silence. Painters brushed camouflage patterns across canvas, stretched over metal frames. Carpenters hammered plywood into the rough shape of aircraft wings. Sound engineers huddled around massive reels of magnetic tape, replaying the low rumble of engines and marching boots over and over until it sounded real enough to fool a spy. This was Operation Fortitude South, the secret war within the war. The people working here were not soldiers, they were artists, sculptors, theatre technicians, and magicians from the world of cinema. And they had been recruited for one purpose, to create a fake army so convincing that it would deceive Hitler himself. Captain Harold Kent, the man in charge, stood at the centre of the chaos, clipboard in hand. He was tall, neatly dressed, and always calm, the kind of officer who believed that imagination could win battles as surely as bullets. "Inflatable Sherman tanks ready for inspection, sir," said a young lieutenant, pointing toward a row of strange, air-filled shapes that shimmered under the lights. Kent walked closer. What he saw looked absurd. Giant rubber tanks, lightweight enough to lift with one hand, yet detailed enough to look deadly from the air. Every rivet, every tread mark was painted with care. "Good," Kent said. "Once they're placed near Dover, the Luftwaffe's cameras should pick them up easily. Make sure the shadows match real tank dimensions. One wrong angle and the illusion falls apart." He turned to a group of painters working on a plywood aircraft. "And how's our Air Force?" A short woman with streaks of green paint on her cheeks looked up from her brush. "Nearly finished, sir. Once the wings dry, we'll scatter them along the fields. Even added oil stains near the engines." Kent smiled faintly. "Beautiful. It's a pity they'll never actually fly." She laughed softly. "Maybe that's what makes them perfect." The heart of the operation was a large room filled with sound equipment, miles of wire, speakers, and recording devices. Here, Major Colin Price, a former sound engineer from the BBC, worked like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra. He played back the sounds of tank convoys moving across gravel, trucks unloading supplies, even men shouting orders through megaphones. Every noise was carefully arranged, timed, and broadcast from hidden speakers across southern England. To enemy ears, it would sound like an entire invasion force gathering for battle. "Think they'll buy it?" asked one of the operators, adjusting a reel. Price chuckled. "They don't need to buy it, they just need to believe it's possible." By nightfall, the warehouse buzzed with quiet excitement. Word had come down from the top. The deception plan had been approved by the Allied command. A fake army, officially designated the 1st U.S. Army Group, would be created under the command of none other than General George S. Patton, the Germans' most feared field commander. Patton himself was not in on the daily details, but his name alone added weight to the illusion. The Germans already believed he would lead the invasion, and now the artists of the warehouse would make that belief tangible. Blueprints were spread across long tables, showing where fake divisions would appear along the English coast. The troops would include inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, wooden jeeps, and entire rows of canvas tents filled with mannequins dressed in Allied uniforms. Everything had to be perfect. Even the radio operators were instructed to create fake chatter between imaginary units, coded transmissions filled with false plans, weather updates, and supply requests. Every word, every sound, every shadow painted across those fake machines was another brushstroke in a masterpiece of deception. Late that night, Captain Kent sat alone in his small office overlooking the factory floor. Rain pattered against the windows. He opened a small notebook and began writing his daily report. Day 12, progress steady. 48 inflatable tanks complete. 12 wooden aircraft painted. Broadcast tests successful. German reconnaissance expected within the week. He paused, tapping his pen against the page. Then he wrote another line, softer, personal. Strange how the fate of thousands may rest on the work of painters and dreamers, but maybe that's the only kind of weapon we have left. Imagination. He closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the muffled sounds of the workers below. The quiet laughter, the rhythm of hammers, the hiss of air pumps filling another fake tank. It didn't sound like war, it sounded like creation. Outside, in the damp streets of London, the city slept under blackout curtains. The sirens had not sounded that night. The Luftwaffe had other targets now. They were watching the southern coast. From high above, the German reconnaissance planes would soon pass over Kent and Sussex, photographing what appeared to be the largest invasion force ever assembled. They would see endless rows of tanks, trucks, and aircraft stretching across the fields, all perfectly positioned to strike at Pas de Calais. What they would not see were the air hoses, the ropes, or the artists hiding behind the illusions. They would not hear the laughter in the warehouse where the fake army had been born. They would not know that the shadow army below was made of paint, plywood, and dreams. When morning came, the first convoy of decoys left London. Trucks rolled out of the warehouse one by one, carrying the deflated rubber tanks and wooden planes covered in tarps. In the driver's seat of the lead truck, Captain Kent looked out at the grey sky and exhaled slowly. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like an ordinary supply run, another shipment of war material heading south. But to Kent and his team, it was the beginning of the greatest performance in military history. A war fought not with bullets but with lies. A battle where victory would be measured not in ground taken, but in what the enemy believed to be true. Narrator's closing lines. In that hidden warehouse, among paints, brushes, and illusions, the first spark of deception was lit. And soon, across the skies of Europe, the eyes of the enemy would look upon a phantom army, one that never truly existed, but would help decide the fate of the real one that did. May 15th, 1944, Dover, England. The sea stretched out grey and endless, waves rolling under a mist that clung to the cliffs of Dover. Along the coast, rows of tanks stood in silence, massive, powerful, and completely fake. Their rubber bodies shimmered faintly under the weak sunlight, filled with nothing but air and illusion. From a distance, through a camera lens or a pair of binoculars, they looked real. They had to, because somewhere high above, German reconnaissance planes were already circling, photographing every inch of southern England. And those planes, those cold eyes in the sky, were what this entire operation was meant for. Captain Harold Kent stood with a map spread across the hood of a jeep. His boots sank slightly into the wet grass. Around him, his small team moved quietly, adjusting tank shadows, repainting camouflage, and setting up thin metal poles that would hold fake radio antennas. Nearby, a group of men was positioning wooden landing craft along the beach. They dragged them through the sand, placing them at just the right angles, as if ready to set sail for the French coast. Kent turned to his assistant, Lieutenant Baker, a wiry man with ink stains on his hands. "Are the radio boys ready?" Kent asked. "Yes, sir. First transmission goes out at 1900 hours. They've got traffic between our infantry divisions and Patton, S headquarters, ready to roll." Kent nodded. Make sure the chatter sounds busy. We want the enemy to think we're preparing for the biggest invasion in history. Baker smiled faintly. We're building an army of echoes, sir. Kent returned the smile. That's exactly what it is. In a nearby tent, Major Colin Price adjusted the knobs of a large radio console. The air inside smelled of coffee and ozone. His team was setting up the next stage of deception. Operation Quicksilver, the radio component of the Great Illusion. Every hour, false communications were to be broadcast from fake units scattered across southern England. Engineers had memorized patterns of real military chatter, call signs, coded weather reports, supply updates, and requests for reinforcements. It was a symphony of lies. "Begin test transmission," Price ordered. A radio operator leaned toward the microphone. "This is Eagle Command to Base Red. Convoy Alpha ready to move on schedule. Repeat, Convoy Alpha ready. Weather holding steady." The words drifted out into the static-filled airwaves, bouncing across the countryside. To anyone listening, it sounded ordinary. To the enemy listening across the channel, it sounded authentic. Price leaned back, adjusting his headphones. "Good. Add some background noise, machinery, footsteps, maybe the wind. Makes it sound more natural." The operator nodded, replaying the same message with added sound effects. After a moment, the entire tent filled with the soft hum of voices and static. Price smiled. "Perfect. Now let's keep them guessing." Outside, the illusion grew. Inflatable trucks lined dirt roads. Canvas tents filled empty fields. Painted shadows were extended to make the tanks seem larger, and at night, dim lights flickered under the tents, simulating soldiers moving about. Everything was built for the camera lens, for the German mind trying to read the patterns of invasion. A small airstrip nearby became home to rows of plywood fighter planes. From the air, they looked ready to take off. Up close, they were hollow shells, their wings light enough for 2 men to carry. Every morning, Kent inspected the site. He'd walk past the rubber tanks and touch them lightly, as if checking on living soldiers. He often thought about the real men across the channel, training in silence, waiting for the real invasion to begin. What he and his team were building here might save thousands of their lives. Late one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon orange, Kent sat with Major Price outside the operations tent. "Do you think it'll work?" Kent asked quietly. Price looked toward the coastline. "It already is. German radio traffic's been picking up. They've started reinforcing Calais." Kent exhaled slowly. "Then maybe we're buying them time in Normandy." Price nodded. "Exactly. Every hour they keep their tanks up north is another hour our real boys can land safely." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the waves crash below the cliffs. The war was still raging, but here, just for a moment, it felt like they were fighting it in a different way, not with bullets, but with creativity. "Funny, isn't it?" Price said. "We are the only soldiers in the war who do not want the enemy to see the truth." Kent chuckled softly. "In this war, truth can wait." 2 days later, the first photographs from German reconnaissance were confirmed. The Allies intercepted enemy messages describing large concentrations of vehicles and troops near Dover and unusual radio activity along the coast. It was working. Kent's team cheered quietly inside their tent. No medals would ever be given for this mission. No one outside a small circle of intelligence officers would ever know their names, but in that moment, their invisible victory meant everything. Price raised his mug of tea. "To the ghosts," he said. "To the ghosts," Kent replied, tapping his cup against Price's. As the days passed, the fake army grew even more elaborate. Loudspeakers hidden in trees played recordings of construction noise, engines, and men shouting orders. Soldiers from nearby real divisions were occasionally brought in to march visibly during German flyovers, adding life to the illusion. Every sight, every sound, every movement was planned with precision. When the Luftwaffe's planes flew overhead again, they captured a sea of activity. Inflatable tanks glistened like steel. Wooden planes cast shadows across the runways. The beaches of Dover appeared crowded with landing craft ready for assault. To the enemy's eyes, the truth was undeniable. The Allied invasion would strike at Calais. And so, in bunkers far away, German officers marked their maps and shifted divisions north, preparing to repel an attack that would never come. Back in Dover, Kent watched from the cliffs as fog rolled in over the sea. Somewhere out there, across the grey water, real soldiers were preparing for the greatest gamble of the war. Operation Overlord. He thought of them, of the men who would storm the beaches under fire, unaware that their path had been cleared by the hands of painters, sculptors, and sound engineers. He smiled faintly, his breath misting in the cold air. Their fake army of air and echoes was working, and soon history itself would follow the trail of their illusions. Narrators' closing lines. Beneath the fog and the silence, an invisible war was being won. The artists and engineers of Britain had built an army that did not exist. And yet, it changed everything that did. June 5th, 1944, south coast of England. The night before D-Day was cold, damp, and utterly silent. From the cliffs above the channel, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind carried a faint smell of salt and diesel. Far out at sea, hundreds of ships gathered in darkness, waiting for the signal that would change history. But 100 miles north of Normandy, near Dover and the Strait of Calais, a different kind of fleet was stirring. One made of air, sound, and light. At 2300 hours, Captain Harold Kent stood beside a truck filled with radio equipment. His men, artists turned illusionists, engineers turned magicians, were ready. Around them, inflatable tanks stood like sleeping giants, and the artificial landing craft glistened under the moonlight. The real Allied armada was sailing south. Their job tonight was to make the enemy believe it was still right here. Kent looked at his watch. "Signal in 10 minutes, he said. Lieutenant Baker nodded, tightening his scarf against the cold. "The ghosts are ready, sir." Nearby, Major Price and his radio team prepared the final transmissions. The loudspeakers were checked, the pre-recorded sounds loaded, engine roars, metallic clangs, men shouting orders, all designed to echo across the channel. When it began, it would sound like an invasion. At precisely 23:10 hours, Price gave the order. "Start transmission." The first waves of sound rolled across the empty fields, jeeps revving, cranes moving, the rhythmic clatter of marching boots. Then came the voices, hundreds of layered recordings mixed into chaos, shouting orders, calling for supplies, counting down to embarkation. From the sky, the illusion was complete. Lights flickered along the coastline as fake landing craft moved in the water, small barges dragging plywood silhouettes to mimic ships. The reflection on the sea shimmered like steel. Kent listened through the headset as the fake radio traffic began. Eagle Command to Base Red. Landing divisions assembled, weather improving, estimated H-hour 0530. He smiled grimly. "Let's make it convincing," he said. Baker turned up the volume on the speakers. The coast roared to life. Across the channel, German radar stations lit up. Operators in Calais and Boulogne stared at their screens as clusters of echoes appeared. Hundreds of ships, moving steadily toward the French coast. At first, they thought it was an error. Then more signals appeared. One officer shouted, "They're coming for Calais! Prepare coastal defenses!" Orders crackled across German command posts. Searchlights swept the sea and artillery crews scrambled to their stations. Somewhere deep inside Hitler's headquarters, the message arrived. Massive Allied invasion fleet sighted heading toward Pas-de-Calais. Back on the English coast, Kent's team watched the lights flicker over the sea. Baker lowered his binoculars. "They've taken the bait. Radio intercepts confirm they've moved the 15th Panzer Division north." Kent exhaled slowly, relief mixing with awe. "Then the real boys in Normandy just got their first ally, a ghost." Price grinned. "Best kind of soldier, sir. Doesn't bleed, doesn't sleep, and never misses his target." Through the night, the illusion continued. RAF bombers joined the deception, dropping Ruperts, small rubber dummies dressed like paratroopers, over empty fields near Calais. Some carried firecrackers or small explosive charges that mimicked gunfire when they hit the ground. From above, it looked like thousands of troops were parachuting behind enemy lines. German spotlights swept frantically across the night sky. Machine guns fired blindly into the darkness. Officers shouted for reinforcements, all for an army that wasn't there. By dawn, the horizon was glowing pale blue. Kent stood near the edge of the cliffs, watching the first light touch the sea. The loudspeakers had fallen silent now, their job complete. The fake tanks gleamed faintly in the morning mist. Behind him, Major Price carried the latest intercept report from Bletchley Park. "They're convinced, sir," he said quietly. "They think this is the main invasion. They've ordered all reserve divisions to hold Calais." Kent stared at the sea. "Then maybe our boys in Normandy will get through the beaches." Price nodded. "It's working. The greatest army in history is being protected by a handful of artists." Kent gave a tired smile. "Let's just hope no one ever finds out how fragile it all was." That same morning, June the 6th, 1944, Operation Overlord began. While real Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command remained convinced the real invasion was still coming to Calais. For 48 hours, Hitler refused to move his panzer divisions south. Thousands of Allied soldiers lived because of that hesitation. And all across southern England, the men of Kent's secret unit listened to the news in silence. They had fought their war not with bullets, but with illusion. Their battlefield was imagination. Their weapon was belief. As evening fell, Kent sat on the cliff again, alone this time. The tide washed gently against the shore below. He thought about the men crossing into France and about the strange, quiet war he and his team had fought. Their tanks had been air. Their planes had been plywood. Their soldiers had been made of sound. Yet somehow it had worked. Narrators' closing lines. The Germans had seen everything, fleets, divisions, paratroopers, but none of it had ever existed. The artists of Britain had built a fake army that fooled the world, and in doing so, they helped bring the real one home alive. June 10, 1944, London, England. The war room was quiet except for the hum of the map projectors and the rustle of paper. On the large wall map of Western Europe, thin red strings stretched from England to France, each one marking a convoy, a landing, or a deception. It had been 4 days since the Normandy landings. 4 days of chaos, courage, and confusion. And yet somehow the German High Command still refused to believe that Normandy was the real invasion. In the heart of London, inside a small, unmarked building, Captain Harold Kent stood with his team around a table covered in intercepted messages. Their secret had worked beyond anyone's expectations. "Interception report," said Lieutenant Baker, sliding a sheet across the table. "German command insists the Normandy attack is a diversion. They're still waiting for the main assault at Calais." Kent ran a hand over his tired face. "Still? Even after 4 days?" Baker nodded. "Yes, sir. They've ordered the 15th Panzer Division to remain north, The deception's holding. Major Colin Price leaned back in his chair, a weary grin spreading across his face. Then our ghosts are still fighting. Kent looked at him and smiled faintly. And every hour they keep believing is another hour our real boys survive. He picked up a pencil and circled a point on the map. This is what shadows can do. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows. The streets of London were dark, the city muffled under blackout curtains. Only the occasional glow of a passing vehicle or the distant siren broke the stillness. Kent stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the city he was protecting in secret. No one walking those streets would ever know what he and his team had done. They wouldn't know about the fake tanks, the rubber ships, the radio illusions. They wouldn't know that art and sound had saved thousands of lives. But Kent knew, and that was enough. Meanwhile, across the channel, the illusion still played on. RAF reconnaissance continued to fly over the fake army sites, ensuring the Germans saw movement and signs of activity. Soldiers were ordered to march in open view during daylight hours. Smoke from campfires was maintained. German spies, carefully fed misinformation through double agents, reported that General Patton himself was still preparing to lead an invasion from Dover. The entire deception network, codenamed Operation Fortitude, had achieved what no bomb could: confusion. On June 12th, a message arrived from Allied headquarters in Normandy. Kent was summoned immediately. He hurried into the war room, where a small crowd had gathered around the teletype machine. The operator pulled the message and handed it to Kent. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently. Enemy reserves still held north of the Seine. Allied advance successful. Deception remains effective. Well done. Kent exhaled, his eyes closing briefly in relief. They believed every word, he murmured. Major Price clapped him on the shoulder. You just helped win D-Day without firing a shot. Kent smiled weakly. We only gave them a story to believe. The real heroes are the ones crossing France. Price nodded. True, but even heroes need a good disguise. That evening, as the rain eased, Kent walked down to the storage hangar, where the fake army lay sleeping. The inflatable tanks sagged slightly, puddles forming on their rubber skins. Wooden planes sat lined against the wall, their paint chipped by salt air. The loudspeakers, silent now, were stacked neatly in crates. He walked among them slowly, his footsteps echoing. These hollow machines had once roared to life with sound and illusion, tricking the most powerful army in Europe. Now they looked almost human. He paused beside one of the rubber tanks and rested a hand against it. You did your part, he whispered. A few days later, orders arrived to dismantle the entire site. Operation Fortitude was officially complete. Baker and his men began deflating the tanks, folding the massive sheets of rubber into piles. The air hissed softly, fading into silence. Feels strange, Baker said, like saying goodbye to ghosts. Kent nodded. They were always ghosts. As the last tank deflated, it collapsed inward with a sigh, the final echo of an invisible army disappearing into history. By late summer, the success of D-Day was undeniable. Allied forces were advancing across France. Paris would soon be free. The tide of war had turned for good. In a debriefing weeks later, Kent met with an intelligence officer from the War Office. The man, dressed in a crisp uniform, flipped through a file filled with photos of the fake army. He looked up and said, "Captain Kent, you and your men did something extraordinary. You made the enemy see what wasn't there." Kent replied quietly, "Sometimes that is what war demands. The courage to make others believe a lie for the sake of the truth." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "History may never mention you, but it will remember what your deception made possible." That night, Kent walked once more along the coast. The sea was calm now, reflecting the stars like silver glass. He thought of the men who had fallen in Normandy and of the strange, silent war he and his team had fought. A war not of bullets or bombs, but of shadows and stories. He turned toward the empty fields where his fake army had once stood. The grass had grown back, hiding the traces of rubber and rope, but in his mind he could still see them, the tanks, the planes, the men who never were. He smiled, because sometimes the things that aren't real can still save what is. Narrator's closing lines. In the great storm of war, truth and illusion often marched side by side, and somewhere between them, in a factory of artists and dreamers, a fake army was built, one that helped win a real victory. They fought not with fire, but with imagination. Their battle cry was silence, and their legacy was the peace that followed.